I see you.
Black billionaires exist. Take, for instance, Oprah, rapper Jay-Z, or tech investor Robert Smith. But their success stories are exceptions to the rule. What if our economic systems that run our nation were rigged? Not by evil puppet masters or villains, but by law-abiding judges, lawyers, policymakers, and lobbyists.
Inequality is just a drag on everybody. Nobody wins when we've got these levels of inequality.
I'm Eddie Robinson, and stay tuned for an unguarded chat with legal scholar and award-winning author Mehrsa Baradaran. How did our political and economic systems become so rigged to help the rich and powerful while keeping so many poor and disenfranchised? Oh yeah, I feel you. We hear you. I see you. You're listening to I See You. I'm your host, Eddie Robinson. The American dream, trademark pending, is deeply rooted in our mythology. The idea that everyone, regardless of your background, has the opportunity for prosperity and upward social mobility. If you work hard enough and have enough gumption, well, all your dreams can come true. But is it really true? These days, the dream seems very unattainable, and the research backs that up. Since 1980, wealth inequality and wealth concentration have been steadily increasing and even surging in the last few years. There are now more billionaires than ever. The U.S. has 737 billionaires with a combined wealth of $5.5 trillion. Meanwhile, Americans are experiencing homelessness at record numbers. A report by the Department of Housing and Urban Development released last December found that more than 650,000 people were experiencing homelessness in America. Many of these families work full-time and yet still struggle to afford rents that have skyrocketed in every part of the country. This is especially the case for Black, Native, and Latino families. In fact, the wealth gap between white and Black Americans is nearly as large today as it was in the 1950s. Yeah, that's before the end of legal segregation. So why are we seeing this persistent wealth gap that's actually widened in the last 4 decades? And are all Americans affected by the policies that lead to these outcomes? Mehrsa Baradaran is the author of the award-winning book, The Color of Money: Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap. Her latest book is The Quiet Coup: Neoliberalism and the Looting of America, published by W.W. Norton and Company. Dr. Baradaran is also a professor of law at the University of California, Irvine, and she joins us from the studios of KUCI. Dr. Baradaran, thank you so much for being a guest on ICU.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
Well, last December, CNN released an investigation into the lending practices of Navy Federal Credit Union, which lends to military service members and veterans. And they found that they had approved more than 75% of white borrowers who applied for a new conventional home purchase mortgage in 2022, but less than 50% of Black borrowers were approved.
The denial letter listed excessive obligations in relation to income as the reason.
When they denied is when we came back and said, oh man, there's something else going on.
And what did you think that something else was?
Discrimination.
The data also shows Navy Federal was more than twice as likely to deny Black mortgage applicants than white ones.
This report really got us thinking about the racial wealth gap here in America today, and what our producers found is not great. In 2021, for instance, the typical white household had 9.2 times as much wealth as the typical Black household. That's nearly a factor of 10, and that's an incredible disparity, especially as we're here 60 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What's been happening here, Professor? Is eliminating this gap as simple as tackling bank discrimination, or does it go deeper than that?
Yes, the latter. It goes deep.
Yeah.
And, that was my last book, The Color of Money, was an exploration of that. I actually started the book writing about banks, focusing on the history of Black-owned banks and as institutions whose specific aim was to build Black wealth. And by studying these banks, what I saw, and hopefully what any reader of that book will see through these banks, is how structural and endemic and embedded is the forces of inequalities. And, the racial wealth gap is one symptom that you see that you can measure. But really the deep core of it is just a disparate topography of access and opportunity. And, I say topography purposefully. It's not necessarily, where you're born determines what your outcome, your opportunities are, but it is sort of like that. And race has, from the beginning of the founding of this country, been synonymous with poverty, and the lack of freedom, and in a way that was very concrete at first, written into the document, but over time has become more of a, you have to measure it and you have to see it through these other ways. And in The Color of Money, I tried to just show, that's kind of the thesis. The color of money is white. And it's not all white people have equal opportunity as others. It's not that at all. It is the fact that if you are Black, the likelihood of, where you're born, what kind of schools you go to, what kind of neighborhood you live in, the overwhelming evidence is that those opportunities are limited. And, now we can look at it and it does seem kind of intangible. What are you talking about? What is this? Is it bank discrimination? Where is the discrimination coming in? And what I try to show in the book is you don't actually even need the discrimination coming in. There weren't Navy, Federal Credit Union, people out there trying to be, racist in some way. It's like in the numbers, it's in the underwriting, it's in what zip code are you coming from, right? What is the algorithm shooting out? You can have a race neutral AI underwriter produce the same outcome given the data, the inputs of history and place and opportunity.
If we could, I would love to just kind of focus on the history of Black wealth. For instance, folks who had been enslaved went from being capital, their bodies, capital as being capital, to having to become capitalists. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of the Freedmen's Savings Bank? Why did the U.S. Congress prefer setting up an institution like this instead of giving land or direct financial support to the formerly enslaved freedmen?
Yeah, when you go back into that time in history and look at the records and look at the conversations, Sherman and Grant and Lincoln and all it was obvious that land was the only way, not just to create an economy in the South in which Black former slaves, now freedmen, and white sharecroppers could participate in capitalism, and also that the cotton oligarchs who had committed treason against the nation by seceding, who had lost that war, would be somehow, punished, or at least that we wouldn't have that same reproduction of the system. And that's not what happened. Lincoln is assassinated, and Andrew Johnson, who, comes into office saying this is a white man's government, and so it shall remain. And so he vetoes the Freedmen's Bureau bill, all but the Freedmen's Bureau Bank. There's other programs that remained of the Freedmen's Bill, and W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction is the document here, right? His just research into this is unmatched. What he shows is that the Freedmen's Bureau bill wasn't a failure because it just was defunct. It was violently overthrown, and there are many instances of this. Any Republican or Black Republican would be basically just killed, and the white office holder would refuse to give up office, or the Klan would show up if you had property. So there's the violence on that side, and then there is the congressional and the Supreme Court's looking away from those rights that were supposedly guaranteed in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And so what you get is this bank, and it's not real. Like, it's not a true thing at the time. Instead of land, you can save your money that you're getting through sharecropping, which is just a completely unfair, exploitative system. You're going to save up those funds and put them in this bank, and then you can buy land. And people did do that, not just Black freedmen, but also, Irish people who had immigrated and couldn't get access to a bank account also had accounts at this bank. And what happened with this pile of money, it was supposed to just stay there. They weren't giving loans. They weren't trying to produce wealth. They were just trying to hold this money. And Jay Cook is a infamous railroad speculator. His brother, Henry Cook, is put as president of the bank and takes the money and blows it on railroad speculation, and it just disappears. There's no, congressional, nothing happens. There's no FDIC at the time, and so people just lose half their money. And even Du Bois, he briefly mentions the Freedmen's Bank failure, and he says, not even 10 additional years of slavery could have done as much damage to throttle the spirit of thrift and business to the community as that failure. Because you have this government institution. I mean, the bills had Lincoln's face on it, and you have this bank account that looks to be growing, and all of a sudden it's gone. So it was a very devastating failure. Then, you have black banks created by many just brilliant, intrepid, brave entrepreneurs in the South and in the North, starting after the Great Migration. And unless you're connected to the federal government, unless there is money coming out, that the Fed is supporting you, the FDIC is subsidizing you, that the FHA loans that were created, the white homeowner society that we had from 1930 until 1970, unless those things are coming to your community, and they were explicitly not. Contractually, you could not give to black homeowners these loans, then you cannot grow wealth in this economy, no matter how many great entrepreneurs you have who set up banks. And that was a reality that was rough to, swallow.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to find out more, the New Deal, right? The New Deal was a series of programs and regulations and projects passed by Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s to kickstart and grow the economy after the stock market crash of 1929. But you know what? I mean, Professor, I read in my social studies class that the New Deal helped all citizens.
Roosevelt's presidency is known for the New Deal, a series of programs and reforms aimed at addressing the Great Depression.
That's it.
Yeah, it did.
End of discussion. Let's move on to chapter 2.
Yeah.
But if you look deeper, some historians went all out to call the New Deal affirmative action for whites.
White affirmative action. It's not hard to see. You really, at the time, it wasn't the secret thing. They went around the country and said, this neighborhood gets these subsidized loans, meaning that the government was going to underwrite the loan. So you got a mortgage for 30 years at a 6% interest rate. You went from living in a tenement in New York City, if you're Irish, Italian, whatever, white, German, $50 a month you were paying in rent. And now you're moving into the suburbs and you're paying $35 a month, and you have a house that's growing in equity and value. You get all these tax subsidies and all of that. And those loans were, where the idea of redlining comes from, with those HOLC maps early on.
Redlining is a discriminatory lending practice denying access to federally backed mortgages and loans to certain communities based on race and ethnicity.
And then it's a program that lasts many decades. You had racial covenants in houses. This house shall not be sold to anyone who's not of Caucasian descent, explicitly. You can find the deeds of any house that was sold during that time. And in the FHA documents, they would go around to the neighborhoods and say this neighborhood is predominantly black and therefore is a redlined area. You can go to Los Angeles. I've looked in Houston, and it's not just blacks. This is Mexican or this is Japanese. And there are different color variations of risk based on the race. So the race of the community was exactly the way that they underwrote. It wasn't there's anything having to do with the house or the development or the prognosis. So, you have a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're saying that's a risky neighborhood, and therefore we're not going to give these loans that can build wealth in that neighborhood. So you've got not just no wealth, you have a sucking out of the businesses, there's not just white flight, it's business flight. Businesses leave the inner cities and go to these suburbs where it's a car society also, right? So you've got roads and cars out there, and in the inner cities where, people that were black couldn't leave because they weren't available mortgages out, you have a diminishing of public transportation. You've got a tax strain at schools, as maybe are paid for by property taxes. And so you've got everything basically linked to those metrics. So for Brown versus Board of Ed, they're you can't segregate based on race.
The court ruled unanimously that racial segregation in public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution.
But in the later years, as I talk about in the next book, you had many cases of black families and, Mexican families in Texas coming to the court and saying, look, this is basically racial segregation, but they're doing it through the white neighborhoods cordoning their money, their tax money into these white schools where it's like disproportionately white, and then right next door is this black-brown school has no money, right? And so like this is discrimination or like a violation of the spirit of Brown, right? And yeah, the court says no, it's not, unless it's like explicitly about race, then you don't. So you get these patterns recreated through other means even after Brown.
I'm Eddie Robinson, and you're listening to ICU. We're speaking with Mehrsa Baradaran. She's a professor at the University of California, Irvine. She's also the author of How the Other Half Banks, The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap, and her newest book entitled The Quiet Coup, Neoliberalism and the Looting of America. We usually think about the civil rights era as beginning in the 60s, even in the 50s, with icons that we learn about in grade school. But some historians would say that the fight for civil rights really started as a reaction to the denial of reparations after the end of the Civil War. Mm-hmm. Many would argue that, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 wasn't all that radical. Mm-hmm. It just recognized the rights of blacks that they had won in the 13th and 14th Amendments.
Absolutely. There was nothing in the civil rights legislation that wasn't already promised in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Yeah. And should have been promised in the Constitution in the first place if it had been taken seriously, that just all men are created equal, right? It was a deregulation of Jim Crow. Jim Crow was a very complex legal system that was imposed in the South to oppress black workers economically where it couldn't be done through slavery. And it was it was like enforced top to bottom. It changed Southern society to meet its legal, dictates. And all the civil rights laws said is no more Jim Crow, right? You can't have white water fountains and black water fountains. You can't have white cars and black, explicitly, you cannot put whites only on these things.
Sure.
And this is that moment that I go back to in this quiet coup, where I say, look, you've got this revolution that is happening not necessarily by the civil rights. It's not that the nation is just kind of like blandly sitting on their couch doing nothing, and all of a sudden Martin Luther King comes on the TV and we have this starting of this thing. The civil rights struggle had been ongoing since there had been, tons and tons of movements, right? It hadn't stopped, the struggle for freedom. And at that moment, the American civil rights struggle converges with what's happening worldwide, which is that empire's ending, not just America's Jim Crow and a lot of the native dispossession laws that we had, like a reservation system, the way that you can cordon off certain populations were copied exactly into the Nuremberg laws and the Nazis.
The Nuremberg codes by studying our Jim Crow laws. And when we protested their treatment of Jews in the 30s, they would look at us and go, Mississippi.
And the same with the British imperialism, their kind of legal system of how do you go into another country, take it over, and impose your rule. The Nazis did exactly that in Europe. And so that system kind of crumbles after the Second World War in the 1950s. And every former colony, we're talking about Africa, India, South America, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, has some sort of independent struggle. You have between 1960 and 1970, the time in the U.S. where we just focus on civil rights, look at any place in the world in 1960 and 1970 is just complete chaos of power. What is going to happen, right? France loses all its colonies. There were like 5 European nations, right? Spain, England, France, Portugal, and Belgium and Germany a little bit had colonies across the world. They'd colonized the entire world. And many of those nations relied on, oil from the Middle East and copper and all this stuff from these countries. At that point, every country revolts against that system, and that converges into the civil rights movement. And Martin Luther King actually calls the civil rights movement a child of a storm, right? And the civil rights leaders in America, all of them, Martin Luther King goes to, India. Malcolm goes to Mecca. Du Bois is, prohibited from the CIA for traveling to Paris. Yeah. Unfortunately, what the Nixon-Kissinger administration decided to do with the help of the British and certain European interests is to recreate empire through corporate power. And the cost of that is diminishing of democracy, not just over there. So every country that's like supposedly gets independence actually doesn't. They don't get sovereignty over their resources. It's a pseudo-independence. And also America loses a lot of the democratic aims. So all the New Deal type help that even the white Americans had gotten through the mortgages, healthcare rights, just the idea that it was society's job to help with poverty and things like that, they lost that.
Coming up, we continue our chat with award-winning author and legal scholar Mehrsa Baradaran. What really happened after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964? How did Richard Nixon co-opt the language of the Black Power movement to justify affirmative action programs? I'm Eddie Robinson. All this and more when I See You returns in just a moment. We'll be right back. If you're enjoying this program, be sure to subscribe to our podcast, I See You with Eddie Robinson. You can hear all the past episodes and be notified when new episodes are released. Also, please take a minute to give us a review or comment. We love getting feedback from our listeners. You're listening to I See You. I'm Eddie Robinson. We're chatting with legal scholar Mehrsa Baradaran. She's the author of the award-winning book, The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap. Her latest release is The Quiet Coup, Neoliberalism and the Looting of America. W.W. Norton and Company is the publisher. In many ways, the work of activists like Dr. King and Malcolm X really began in earnest in the late 60s and into the 70s, as they were both addressing economic justice as the real struggle for equality.
Yeah.
Were there any advancements as a result of their efforts? Did anything happen to help reduce that wealth gap in this particular era?
Not really, but what does happen is more white people become poor.
Interesting.
So if that's a win, then maybe. But it used to be pretty, race specific.
Sure.
And after that era, especially once you follow into Nixon, Reagan era, more neighborhoods, more towns become like the Black Ghetto used to be, which is under-resourced. You have more vitality sucked out of more places because the same thing that had been done to Black Americans, which is blame them for their own poverty, that was a state choice, is done to more Americans. And that's what I mean by you lose your democratic rights, which is a share of the profits that we all make as a nation. And that spreads out across most America at this point.
The sacred rule of American economic policy has become the notion that free markets cannot be touched.
Yeah.
They shall not be regulated. But in the last 50 years, the unregulated free market has not led to widespread economic advancement for Americans, no matter how hard they work. Yeah. When did this free market ideology take root?
Yeah.
And what does it have to do with race, Professor?
Okay, that's lots there in that question, and the book tries to answer that because what I show is that, the Nixon administration, and I show this in Color of Money, basically co-opts the language of the Black Power movement. And the Black Power movement is saying, sovereignty, we want sovereignty and power in that we want to make our own decisions. We want, if there's going to be a Black segregated neighborhood, we want to own the banks in that neighborhood, right? That's what Malcolm is saying. That's what Martin is saying. It becomes kind of Black power, Black sovereignty. And Nixon takes that and says, yes, Black power, Black capitalism. That's what you're going to get, right? So he's the first Republican to take the South again on a very covert, dog whistling agenda, which is that they're not going to get any of the money, the Black people. And so he's using, yes, we're going to have Black power, Black capitalism, you should have your own banks, whatever. But what that means is they're going to keep segregation, not do anything, and just use the verbiage of capitalism. What do they get? There's affirmative action. That's Nixon's program. He asks, GM and GE and these big companies to just hire 50,000 Black workers. And it becomes immediately controversial. And it actually feeds Nixon's agenda later, right? Because it's showing, these are special treatment, it's special privileges, where it was just a right that was never recognized. I mean, there was like no black people hired, and then they're saying, well, at least hire a few. And now that looks like special privileges. So that's one program. But globally and broadly, the very concept of freedom gets co-opted. And that's kind of what I go into in the second book. And I wanted to like label the book, I wanted to call the book Freedom Fighters, right? Because you have this idea of freedom fighters from Ireland, the IRA, to Black Panthers, right? Not coordinated among groups, but just similar visions, which is sovereignty, freedom. And then you get this Mont Pelerin Society, this group of European intellectuals and Austrian and American intellectuals who are funded by some corporate donors. And it's a small group at that point, but it gets infused into the Nixon administration through several of his advisors. And what they say is freedom is only possible through a free market. And when they say free market, it is the opposite of a free market. Okay, so what these other countries are saying is, for example, Iran, major oil exporter to Europe, to the British. The British came in 1910, took oil for no money and kept it, you know. And so in 1953, the Iranians say, look, you can have our oil, but you have to buy it on the market. You can't just take it. Okay? No matter what this contract that someone gave you in 1910 says, that's colonialism. You have to buy our oil. And instead of doing that, the CIA and the British intelligence joined forces quietly to overthrow this president that was democratically elected.
For the first time now, the CIA has released documents that show its role in the 1953 coup. That is the coup that toppled Iran's democratically elected prime minister. Mohammad Mossadegh had moved to nationalize oil production in Iran. Well, the U.S.
and then put in their person who will just give them the oil. That happens over and over again. And so a lot of these countries, they're saying, look, you can trade with us. We want free trade. Okay? You can buy stuff. You just can't take it. You can't take over our governments, et cetera. Then the corporations didn't want to do it. There was the Seven Sisters oil companies, right? There was a cartel, basically.
That's
you know,
right.
if you were trying to impose your prices, it's just like basically a fight between these countries and these corporations who don't want to pay fair prices. So if it were a free market, if freedom had been the strategy at that point, you know, wouldn't be socialism by any means. That's the whole thing. Is like the free market people say, oh, it's about communism and capitalism. It has nothing to do with that. We don't want American empire. We don't want Soviet empire. We just want our own self-determination, right? You know, we just want to have our own resources and not have this corporation making our political choices. And so then market freedom becomes the rhetoric to overwhelm the actual fight for freedom. What happened in America through that ideology of market freedom is just a loss of freedom, in that it's really just freedom for capital, and then it becomes a joke.
I'm Eddie Robinson. This is ICU. We're speaking with Mehrsa Baradaran. She's one of our leading public intellectuals and a professor at the University of California. She's also the author of The Quiet Coup, Neoliberalism and the Looting of America. You know, after the Civil Rights Movement in the turbulent 70s, you know, we started seeing these overt white supremacist figures get a foothold into American politics, like, you know, Ku Klux Klan Grand Wizard David Duke.
Yeah.
You know, you get this notion that folks are complaining that, you know, white prosperity was being sacrificed for black prosperity. The 80s comes into the picture with President Ronald Reagan, you know, with a seemingly race-neutral economic message of unregulated markets, so to speak. So at the end of the day, you know, I'm wondering who are the winners and the losers of Reaganomics?
Yeah.
And is this what you refer to today with the term neoliberalism?
Right. So neoliberalism is a term that they use to describe themselves. We're neoliberal, like liberalism, like the classic liberalism of like Adam Smith or whatever. And they're saying we're just reviving that. You know, I've read Adam Smith, and Adam Smith is not saying anything close to what the neoliberals are saying. Neoliberalism becomes this dominant ideology that does cohere into an agenda policy-wise, right? So it's, you know, supposedly free markets. What that means, though, is tax cuts for wealthier people. Not freedom in that you actually have market competition, because now you've got 5 major firms that control the entire economy. In any given sector, it's trending toward monopolization. And that's what happens in the Reagan administration, is just like deregulating all the antitrust rules. Finance becomes this behemoth. It becomes the industry that rules all the rest. First Amendment, corporations now get the First Amendment rights. Affirmative action is just for diversity, that you cannot correct past racism through new law anymore after Lewis Powell. And this guy was, truly, he's the guy that helped Philip Morris cast doubt on the cancer-producing carcinogens in tobacco. And he's also on the Richmond School District after integration, and he's just a brilliant lawyer, and through legal maneuvering makes it such that only 3 kids have to integrate, So he avoids Brown without having to do like the massive resistance that the South does. He's saying like, just chill out. Let me handle it. That's kind of the vibe of neoliberalism, is don't bring up race, but get that same thing done through other means. The other means is you have to bankrupt the law and the system of justice in order to do that. And that is what happened slowly over the last several decades, is in order to not give Black Americans and global South, people their rights, their equal rights to their own autonomy, you have to take it away almost from everybody. You have to water down the guarantees that were in the Constitution. And so you see with the Supreme Court now, it's not, you've got the big cases like the, transgender bathrooms, like the things that people look at, but the cases that people don't pay attention to are, you're losing your rights to a jury trial. Everything is arbitration. You got clicks. Corporations can basically do whatever. You can't regulate. The regulators are losing their power on regulating environmental stuff. So the government is becoming powerless, or has already perhaps become powerless, to rein in corporations. And, to the extent of like taxation, they don't have to pay taxes to America anymore. They're not. They're all chartered in some Cayman Islands, thing. So we just lost the cohering threads of our democracy through that process. And that's why I call it a quiet coup, because the coups that were loud were at the time the 60s, like the Black Panthers, like that was a coup.
There you go.
And then this is like a very quiet coup of, lawyers and judges, and not everybody. You just needed a few people to go in, change the doctrine. And there were several influential people, and they were all funded.
That's it.
By motivated corporations. And I follow those also, the right-wing think tanks that were created at the time, and to go into the places of like the academy, and here's media, and here's the courts, and here's the regulatory system, and you can sort of track it. It's a lot of change, and the ideology of it being, free markets are good, which is true, actually. And this is where, and the book is like, we have no beef. I have no beef with free markets. That's what we want. We want free markets. That's what I want. And in order to have free markets, every person has to have freedom.
That's what I love about this particular book, because that quiet coup, it's being all carried out under the blanket of freedom, under the banner of freedom, when it really, really isn't. There's a huge asterisk.
Yes. It's not freedom. It is bankrupting the word, bankrupting liberty, and that's too bad, because we want those words. Those words mean something. The consequences of that aren't just, we have a free market and corporations are corrupt and they're offshore. The real consequence, I think, is the rise of the conspiracy theorists, because people understand at a gut level, something smells fishy, something's wrong. And historically, when people have that feeling, they point to some group. It's the Jews. That's Marjorie Taylor Greene. She, with the PG&E fire, she says, it's the Rothschilds over there. Where did she get that name? Some internet thread of just, Nazi residue that's still there for picking up from
that's the perfect word.
Right, from people who are angry and resentful and need to blame somebody.
Q is a patriot. We know that for sure, but we do not know who Q is. People believe that Q is someone very close to President Trump. According to him, many in our government are actively worshiping Satan.
And all she has to do is look, space lasers and Rothschilds, and that is compelling, more compelling than what I'm saying. She's the highest revenue producing congressperson. And, I don't want to say that we're the same, but we probably have the same feeling of injustice happening, and what we do with that is based on all sorts of things. I'm hoping to talk to the Americans also who are compelled by that story. And I do worry, because that's exactly what happened in Germany. Before Hitler took over, there was economic devastation. And I come from a country where the same thing happened, where these right-wing, fascist, Islamo-totalitarian theocracy, whatever you want to call it, was fascism. When I was born, 1978, Iran was free, just had a revolution. And by my year one, 1979, they had taken over. And I mean, they killed so many people, jailed the rest. Women lost every right they had earned. The marriage age for women changed from 18 to 13. Okay. And war, and I mean, it was Iran went to 8 years of war. We still haven't escaped that totalitarianism.
Well, that's what I'm curious. I'm wondering, is this what inspired you to dedicate yourself to this work?
Perhaps I was writing, because I ended up in the 70s. Yeah, I understood at the time in Iran, because I was a kid, I was aware, they sent my mom to prison, and I came to America and I was like, wow, this country is so free. And there it was horrible. And I've always understood, and every Iranian understands, that the U.S. played a role in all of it. I mean, all of it. But these people that came up, the Islamic fascists, were part of us. They were always there. That's the thing. They were always there. They just were such a minority. There was always men who wanted to drag women of Iran back to the, 15th century. We never had Islamic rule, actually, because Islam came to Iran in 500 AD. We were like the Persian Empire. We didn't have Islam. It came, we got the language, we got the religion, we got the mosques. We did not get the Sharia law until 1978.
Wow. What happened to your mother?
She formed a group of mothers against the war. They were just sending these boys, like 8-year-old boys, into cannon fodder, and it was against Saddam Hussein. So both sides were being given weapons by Halliburton to throw each other's boys into war and die for 8 years. How, like hundreds of thousands of boys and men. And my mom formed this group, and then they found her, whatever, and they took her away and they put her in prison for 3.5 years. And we got out, like, just miraculously. My dad, they kind of owned him because he got his medical training through the Shah, like through the army. That was how he paid for it. So he was an army doctor. So he had to go to the front lines and do brain surgeries. And he was the last brain surgeon left in Iran, basically. They anyone who could leave left. And he couldn't leave. And so he did brain surgery on one of the top guys. And the first thing he says, get my wife out of prison. And then we left like within a couple of days. And then, thank goodness, some diplomat in Germany gave us visas to come. When Trump was elected, I felt like, oh, this is coming. You're blaming this group of, it's the Muslims' fault. We're just like, gosh, you guys, this is, and I get it. I do understand. I understand that when things are problematic, you go to the outsider, you go to the other. And yet that's not been the driving motive of American society. It has been there. Like I'm saying, like these men, these Islamic guys, they were part of us. They were always there. So I feel like I think Americans maybe underplay that element that's here also, that would resort to violence internally also, Often it starts just like that. Just they say, oh, it's those guys. It's these guys. It's, yeah, it's the DEI, it's the feminists, it's whatever.
Coming up, we wrap up our chat with the award-winning author, Mehrsa Baradaran. Do you think there's anything that can be done to course-correct the economic policies of our country? Or is it too little, too late, or too big to overhaul? Let us know your thoughts. What do you think about the term neoliberalism? And do you think there's such a thing as a free market? Email us your thoughts. talk@iseeushow.org. I'm Eddie Robinson. Our final segment of I See You comes your way right after this. If you're enjoying this program, be sure to subscribe to our podcast, I See You with Eddie Robinson. You can hear all the past episodes and be notified when new episodes are released. Also, please take a minute to give us a review or comment. We love getting feedback from our listeners. This is I See You. I'm your host, Eddie Robinson. We're speaking with Mehrsa Baradaran, celebrated legal scholar and author of the award-winning book, The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap. Her newest book is called The Quiet Coup, Neoliberalism and the Looting of America, published by W.W. Norton & Company. So, Dr. Baradaran, we've spoken about the rise of neoliberal policies and how that's led to an eroding of democratic safeguards and a concentration of wealth.
Yeah.
That's affected all Americans. But I think a lot of listeners would say, wait, hold on there.
Yep.
Sure, there is inequality, but there are also a lot of very wealthy Black people, even several billionaires. Also, Asian households, according to Pew Research, are overall wealthier than whites. But at the end of the day, Professor, why has Black wealth remained so low despite the successes of some?
Race is the best political weapon. If you want to split a group of people whose interests are aligned, this is exactly what happened in Reconstruction. Du Bois says the same thing. The white sharecroppers and the Black sharecroppers were about to join together to say, look, there's these 5 guys over there that are forcing us into this cotton debt market. What the Democratic Party was able to do in the South is to take the whites away from that solidarity by giving them white supremacy. And it wasn't much. Du Bois calls it the wages of whiteness. It's not a lot. The wages of whiteness are very meager, but some people will take them. And this is exactly what Nixon did. Instead of, look, worldwide freedom struggle, let's go to the South and show them, prove to them that it's their fault. It's those guys' fault. It's the breaking up of coalitions that racism does. And so those things are there. It's not created, but it's stoked. And it's easy, because it shouldn't be. And I think now it's getting harder because of our access to each other. And I really do have hope for that, in that the market has actually linked us all in different races and places, but we still do this territoriality, and we still say, not just Black people in America, but Black nations and brown nations are still struggling, is because of these ideologies that won't die because they're useful to systems of power.
I was hesitant, but I'm going to go ahead and read. This is a recent news article that I saw from AP that a Texas Attorney General, Ken Paxton, is investigating a key Boeing supplier that has been manufacturing parts linked to, crashes. He's also asking for a breakdown of their workforce by race, sexual orientation, and other factors to determine whether the makeup has changed over time.
That's weird. Oh, my God.
Some conservatives have tried to link aviation safety to diversity in manufacturers.
As part of the investigation, Paxton wants the company to hand over documents related to manufacturing defects in their products. He also wants the company to turn over documents related to its diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, or DEI. It's the latest effort by conservatives to target such programs, and Paxton aims to examine if the company's DEI commitments compromise the quality of its manufacturing.
Would this be an example, Professor, of the quiet coup?
Exactly. Because it's what's happened to Boeing is what's happened to every corporation is the forces of finance and monopolization. You get a private equity firm, you create a corporation that used to make good things and compete on that, now is having to compete on financial levels. It has to be revenue every year, over, in and out, right? So, if you're not producing yield and alpha, you got to squeeze more out. And so where do you squeeze? You lower your staff, you close down things, you make crappier products. You see it across the board, right? And so capital needs growth on these balance sheets, just growth at all costs, like cancer, right? And, shareholders are us, right? So it's kind of like a self-cannibalizing system where you've got the capital needing to grow into our 401ks. And where is it coming out of? It's these private equity firms coming in and squeezing the companies that are still making things like Boeing. And then you get all of these things that are not up to par. And also, the regulators have lost power to go in there and regulate because people say, that they're anti-government. They're like, that's government excess. Let the market handle it, right? Where like airline safety has never been about the market.
Yeah.
So you had the aviation safety rules and all of this, and those government agencies have become weakened, and that's what's causing it. And the fact I didn't realize it was blamed on diversity, but I'm not at all surprised.
The looting of America.
Yeah.
I mean, like you call it, it's like an invisible force that makes it feel like economic equality when it's not, you know.
And I got that looting phrase. I put it in the introduction. Well, during the protests, there were some lootings, I guess.
Sure.
The Onion had this article that was titled, "Protesters Criticized for Looting Without Forming a Private Equity First." And I for days I laughed because it's right. I mean, if you do it legally and you go in, and I teach business association, I taught them a leverage buyout. And I'm like, they get this loan, they go in, they saddle debt on this company, and then they fire everybody. The company goes bankrupt and they get their money. And they're like, why is this legal? I'm like, exactly. Right. And it's a looting of a company. And, it's just the people downstream can't do that because they don't have the lawyers that the private equity firms have. And it's legal, right? It's legal. It's just, well, if you buy laws, then what is the law?
You're listening to ICU. I'm Eddie Robinson. We're speaking with legal scholar Mehrsa Baradaran, author of The Quiet Coup, Neoliberalism and the Looting of America. Where do we go from here? How can we change the system? Is it too much, too little, too late to correct a system that's hundreds of years old on some levels, probably certainly 50 years old when you talk about neoliberalism? But how do we create change?
Yeah.
And please don't say vote.
No, I'm not going to actually. I think because this book, like I said, this book was hard for me to write because I did not see in politics the answer, because I was the nominee for the highest banking agency during the Biden administration. I was on both the transition teams. So I was deep into that financial world, and I got the nomination. So there was enough forces in the Democratic Party to get a reformer. What happened with my nomination is it just kind of went away after 8 months, and then nobody got nominated. There is no Senate-confirmed nominee. We couldn't get the votes on me or on any banking regulator to get that. So after that point, that was, in the middle of writing this book, I got really hopeless for a long time about, well, if I can't, not just me, but if we can't get a single nominee after getting the presidency, this is an executive agency. So I have ideas on this, but I think more than that, it's my job here is to help people see out of this and see a little bit above it. Because what occurred to me at the end of this book, my 401k money, which I've had a job, I put money in, I kind of click the button that says diversified fund, was invested in companies like Raytheon and Exxon and JP Morgan. I didn't have a choice, but that was, we're all invested in this system that is on our necks. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of ways out. And I do think that the market can get to justice faster, but we can't sacrifice other people. And because I think freedom is this calculation that can't be maneuvered. And the calculation for freedom is that either we're all free or none of us are free. Because the other thing I'm saying about neoliberalism and this free market ideology is not just that it's immoral and destructive, it's that it's not profitable. We're not doing our best. We're not producing our best. We're, as a globe, but as a nation, it's sucked the vitality out of the market as well, this ideology. We're not competitive. If you're a small business and you want to go up against a tech firm, you're either going to get swallowed or litigated.
Right.
So that's not a free market. And I think the law, and I'm maybe betraying my industry here, but the law is the problem. It's so impenetrable and so complex, and that complexity is used to shield some just non-free market stuff.
That's it. And will there ever be reparations?
Yes, we have to have justice to advance. And justice requires actual factual equality, not just in paper. Even for profits, even for a free market, we must get everyone to the same starting point. That's kind of the basic thing. So absolutely. And reparations, anytime that the government wants to create wealth, it does it. It just directs money over there. We could have done reparations at any point without any loss, with only upside. Nobody loses. Everyone wins because we have fewer pockets of poverty, and the inequality is just a drag on everybody. nobody wins when we've got these levels of inequality.
The experiences that you've gained from appearing on TV shows, guest appearing on conferences, symposiums, events across the country. Mm-hmm. Professor, what lessons have you learned about yourself thus far?
Oof. Gosh, I think this book taught me that my research agenda was not really something that I consciously was. I think there's just like a lot going on that maybe I was processing my childhood trauma through writing. A lot. Yeah. And it's not like it's a bad idea, but maybe, it would have been easier to go to therapy or something. But, I think I was chasing an idea. I was looking for when did it go wrong? And, I think it was just, it became bigger and also smaller, in that I think I wanted just the basic messages, it's not fair to do that to certain people, and that our struggle is the same wherever we are. And it's that we all want the same things. We all want freedom and autonomy, and it's possible. There's no scarcity in the world. There's no scarcity. I don't know if people understand that. There's no scarcity of food. There's no scarcity of stuff. We can all live and eat and have shelter. What we have a scarcity of is imagination, hope, and love of each other. And those things are manufactured scarcities. They're not pre-existing. They're not endemic to humans.
She's professor of law at the University of California, Irvine, and award-winning author Mehrsa Baradaran. Thank you so much for being a guest on ICU.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our incredible team includes technical director Todd Holslander, producers Laura Walker and Mincho Jacob. Special thanks to Kevin Stockdale and KUCI. ICU is a production of Houston Public Media. Follow us on Instagram and X. We're at ICU Show. On Facebook at ICU Radio Show. Subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen and download your favorite shows. You can also catch us on our show page, ICUshow.org. I'm your host and executive producer, Eddie Robinson. And I feel you. We hear you. I see you. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time.